Now, first is Theo Andreou, who studied in Durham for his BA and MA. He is pondering his PhD thesis. He teaches at TMES, the Theatera Midland Ecclesiastical Seminary. He teaches youth club, and he is about to... Have they published it? No.
Not yet.
Not quite. So there's an article on the Mother of God in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the early one, which he has written for St Andrew's University. Who am I? I am Father Stephen Maxfield. I am the parish priest here in Shrewsbury. We started this community in 1986. We have a church dedicated to the Holy Fathers of Nicaea, which is why we are keeping this festival particularly for our archdiocese. The reason we dedicated it to the Holy Fathers of Nicaea was because I originally wrote to Archbishop Methodios and I said, we'd like the community to be dedicated to St Winifred. And he only communicated with postcards. And he wrote a postcard back and said, who is she? So I said, well, she's a Western saint. To which he replied, there are none. So I thought, right, how orthodox can we be so we will take the Holy Fathers of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council, for which there can be no argument. So that's why we're dedicated to them. But there are other reasons. The feast always falls in Pascha, so it's never a fast, and it is always on a Sunday. So there are practical reasons. Okay. Right, Theo, over to you. Is this yours? Mm-hmm. Yes, right.
Today, in celebration of the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325, I have been given the task of discussing the topic of persecuted church to imperial church. Though, admittedly, such a title is somewhat of a misnomer that requires clarification. Strictly speaking, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire as a result of the Edict of Thessalonica issued by Theodosius I in 380. It is this legislation that can be said to mark the beginning of an imperial church proper. Yet, by this time, though certainly not without interruption, the church had already enjoyed various benefits from the patronage of the state, which had been granted by Constantine I almost 70 years earlier. In Constantine's engagement with Christianity at large, and in his involvement in ecclesiastical affairs in particular, one can easily locate the first steps towards the official Christianization of the empire to his reign. Given that we are gathered in commemoration of the Council of Nicaea, which was convened by the Emperor Constantine, in what follows, I will focus not on the eventual establishment of an imperial church under Theodosius, but rather on his predecessor's significant contribution towards the gradual baptism of Rome. Additionally, to qualify what is meant by persecuted church, it should be noted that prior to the legislated universal toleration of Christianity, amongst other religions in 313, the persecution of Christians was not a perpetual or unrelenting feature of Roman life. Rather, hostility towards Christians was predominantly sporadic and localized. Only in 250, after the ascendancy of Decius to the throne in 249, was persecution enacted on an imperial scale for the first time. But even so, after the death of Decius and his immediate successors, Gallus and Valerian, the latter of whom likewise took up the mantle of systematic oppression, persecution largely came to a halt. Gallienus, who rose to power in 260, issued a decree to end the persecution of Christians. He ordered the cessation of violence against them and the restoration of their places of worship to them. Though there were occasional outbursts of hostility towards Christians following this edict, Gallienus had ushered in 43 years of near tranquility. It was a time, according to the church historian and bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, in which the churches everywhere were at peace. When speaking of a persecuted church, we ought to bear this qualification in mind. Going forward then, my objective is threefold. First, I will provide a brief historical overview of the waves of persecution endured by Christians prior to 313. This will also supply important context for later discussion. Second, I will explore the impact of Constantine on the future of Christianity in the empire, whilst also analysing the influence of Christianity on him. Third, I will offer a short reflection on two questions raised by the so-called Constantinian shift, the transition from persecuted church to the beginnings of an imperial church. Is imperial patronage of the church, along with the idea of a Christian emperor, something inconceivable to, or even incompatible with, the writings of Christians who belonged to the persecuted church, who experienced periods of both turmoil and prosperity, and reflected on their relationship to the empire and its ruler in each epoch? And is there a precedent in Christian history that could be seen as providing grounds for, at least in part, Constantine's imperial involvement in the ecclesiastical affairs of the 4th century? With the framework of this presentation now articulated, I turn to the first of these objectives: tides of persecution. Over the course of the 1st century, as theological differences were brought to light, Christians gradually became disambiguated from Jews and began to be conceptualized as a distinct group. This demarcation excluded Christians from the customary toleration that Rome had extended to the Jewish people. It was during this period of an emerging independent identity that one of the first major instances of persecution against Christians was instigated, following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Fueled by high winds, colossal flames roared about the city. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 were untouched, 3 were entirely destroyed, and in the remaining 7, only a few shattered, half-burnt relics of houses were left. According to Tacitus, writing about 50 years later, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians. He reports that vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for their hatred of the human race. These Christians were torn to pieces by dogs, crucified, or tied to posts in public spaces so that when daylight failed, they were burned to serve as lamps by night. Tacitus's narration, which associates Christians with the performance of abominations and a supposed hatred of the human race, offers an early glimpse into how they were damningly perceived in the 1st century. A similar sense of disdain appears in the writings of his contemporary, Suetonius, who refers to Christians as a class of men given to a new and wicked superstition. As Friend notes, the word maleficus used here carries the connotation of magic or black magic. Within popular consciousness, it is apparent that Christians were increasingly seen as subversive and incongruous with Roman society. Nero's actions, then, whilst not motivated by ideological reasons, nonetheless set a precedent for condemning Christians to death for no other reason than being Christian. By the 2nd century, Christian had become a dirty word. Around 112 AD, Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, wrote to the Emperor Trajan concerning his recent encounter with Christians. He was aware that there were grounds for executing them, though he was unsure of proper procedure. Was the name itself, even without offences, or only the offences associated with the name, worthy of punishment? Despite this, Pliny did not hesitate to execute individuals for refusing to disavow their beliefs, because, he asserts, their stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. Persistent adherence to Christ was now a further motive for condemning Christians to death. Later on, Pliny relates that accusations began to spread, and an anonymous document which listed the names of alleged Christians was brought to his attention. In order for each of the accused to be acquitted, the governor required them to invoke the pagan gods, offer a prayer with incense and wine before an image of the emperor, and cursed Christ. During the interrogations, the Christians explained that after the liturgy, they would reconvene to share ordinary and innocent food. This emphasis on the mundanity of their meal implies that they were already suspected of cannibalism, a charge that would be explicitly levelled against them in subsequent decades, likely arising from a distorted view of the Eucharist. Closing his letter, Pliny reveals his concurrence with Tacitus and Suetonius. Christianity, he remarks, is a perverse and extravagant superstition. In response, Trajan commended Pliny for his handling of the situation. He instructed that Christians were not to be actively sought out, but if accused and proven guilty, they were to be punished. Pardon could be obtained, but only by denying their faith in Christ and worshipping the Roman gods. This correspondence profoundly influenced the shape of Christian persecution in the ensuing decades. It was circulated throughout the empire in the 2nd century and provided Roman officials with a loose rubric for conducting the trials of Christians. Trajan's stance was later reiterated by his successor, Hadrian, in a rescript sent to the proconsul of Asia, Caius Minucius Fundanus, around 125. Notably, those found making false accusations were liable to punishments similar to those of the crimes they alleged. Within this framework of persecution in the 2nd century, Christians had begun to develop a rich theological interpretation of martyrdom. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, for example, rooted the salvific nature of his suffering in the afflictions and death of Christ. Writing to Christians in Rome as he journeyed there to be fed to wild beasts, the bishop implores them not to interfere. "Leave me," he writes, "to imitate the passion of my God." For Ignatius, it was the imitation of Jesus that transformed the lion's teeth into a way to God and their stomachs into a sepulchre from which he would rise again. This confidence, granted by his emulation of Christ, is a recurring feature in subsequent martyrologies. The same theme also appears in Eusebius's account of the large-scale persecution that erupted in Lyon and Vienne in Gaul under Marcus Aurelius in 177, particularly in the figure of Blandina, a slave girl whose faithful endurance whilst being spread-eagled on a post encouraged her spiritual siblings by allowing them to see with their outward eyes in the person of their sister the one who was crucified for them. 3 years after this massacre, 7 men and 5 women from Scilly, probably a small town near Carthage in North Africa, were brought before the proconsul Saturninus. Following an investigation which broadly adhered to the guidance of Trajan, they were put to death. These executions ensured that the century's closing years were overshadowed by fear and uncertainty for those who bore the name Christian. Writing during this period, the North African theologian Tertullian captures this sentiment in a single line. "If the Tiber rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its waters up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there is an earthquake, if there is famine or pestilence, straightway the cry is, 'Away with the Christians to the lion.'" At the cusp of the 3rd century, persecutions persisted, yet between the final years of Septimius Severus and the death of Alexander Severus in March 235, there appears to have been a moment of respite. It was a time characterized by Firmilian, Bishop of Cappadocian Caesarea, as a lengthy period of peace. Following this era, however, a transition can be discerned in the role played by Roman emperors and officials in the persecution of Christians. Whereas previously they had mostly been passive recipients of demands from the people for the destruction of Christians, they now began to take the initiative. This was true of Alexander Severus's supplanter, Maximin of Thrace, but especially of Decius, who was mentioned earlier. After defeating the Emperor Philip in September 249, Decius ascended to the throne, determined, it seems, to restore the former glory of Rome. To accomplish this, he aimed to strengthen the empire's perimeter against barbarian incursions and to unite the Roman people through a renewed devotion to the traditional gods. In an effort to secure the latter, Decius issued an edict in the preliminary months of his reign, which required all the inhabitants of the empire, not just citizens, to offer an oblation to the gods, partake of the sacrificial meal, and swear that they had done so. Upon fulfilling these acts, one would obtain a labellus, a certificate dispensed by Roman officials as proof of compliance. The same decade would also see the deputy prefect of Alexandria instruct a Christian to worship the gods that preserve the empire. In light of the above, it is clear that Christian refusal to sacrifice had moved beyond simple obstinance. It was now framed as a threat to the Pax Romana. Many Christians throughout the empire acquiesced. Some paid bribes, and others attempted to flee. It was in this climate that the question of whether lapsed Christians should be rebaptized arose. One of the foremost voices in this debate was Cyprian of Carthage, who staunchly defended the position that there is one baptism which is appointed in the Catholic Church for the remission of sins. Cyprian's view ultimately prevailed and was later affirmed in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed in 381 by the so-called Imperial Church. After the death of Decius and the subsequent removal of his immediate successor Gallus, Valerian initially tolerated Christianity. Eventually, however, he adopted a similar policy to that of his predecessor. Yet, in addition to this, Valerian forbade Christian services and confiscated churches and their contents. It is possible that the seizure of goods was partly motivated by the severe financial crisis that had long beset the empire by this point. At first, Valerian met resistance with exile or compulsory labor in salt mines. As of August 258, the punishment was death. In the following month, Cyprian was executed after being declared an enemy to the gods and the religion of Rome, and the pious, most sacred and august emperors. When considered alongside the words of the Alexandrian deputy prefect, it is clear that Christians had become widely regarded as dissidents to civic order and incongruous with Roman life. This perception will be important to bear in mind when we later examine the Christian view of both the empire and their relationship to it. Valerian was captured and killed by the Persians in 260. As mentioned earlier, it was his son, Gallienus, who decreed an end to the persecution of Christians and ordered the restitution of their property. With this newfound freedom, Christianity flourished exponentially, and believers were becoming increasingly comfortable with expressing their faith publicly. Recounting this period of growth, Eusebius writes, "Who could describe those vast collections of men who flocked to the religion of Christ, those multitudes crowding in from every city, and the illustrious concourse in the houses of worship? On their account, not content with the ancient buildings, they erected spacious churches from the foundation in all the cities." By 300, after having ruled for 16 years, even the Emperor Diocletian found his imperial palace in Nicomedia facing a church. Beyond the empire's borders, Armenia, led by its king, embraced Christianity, as did the Georgians around the same time. Evidently, paganism was once again on the decline. In 286, Diocletian divided his rule of the empire with Maximian, who took charge of the west. Then, in 293, each emperor appointed a deputy ruler, further dividing imperial power into four. Within this tetrarchy, Diocletian and Maximian held the title of Augustus, whilst their respective deputies, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, the father of Constantine the Great, assumed the title of Caesar. After the establishment of the Tetrarchy, much effort was made to cultivate a divine image of the emperors, one which cast them as the gods Jupiter and Hercules. These associations attempted to illustrate the extent of the emperor's fervour towards the old gods. The persecution of Christians resumed after a series of ominous events. In Antioch in 298, Christian army officers had made the sign of the cross during an animal sacrifice to the gods in celebration of a successful conclusion to the Persian War, an act which incurred blame for disturbing the reading of their entrails. Immediately, Christians were expelled from the legions. Around this time, an edict was issued against the Manichaeans, in which the Tetrarch's commitment to traditional Roman religious practices was articulated with great vigour, and their hostility to perceived challenges to those practices was made very clear. Soon after, in late 302, Diocletian and Galerius visited the oracle of Apollo in Didyma, who declared that Christians were obstructing his powers of divination, an interference, he warned, that would unleash untold evils upon the world. Once again, Christians were being branded as disruptors, tearing at the fabric of the empire's cohesion, which, supposedly, was founded upon the worship of the gods and the emperors. Heeding this dire message, in February 303, Diocletian orchestrated a raid on the church he frequently saw from his palace in Nicomedia, dismantling the building and destroying its contents. The next day, an edict was issued, mandating the destruction of churches and the burning of scriptures. House-to-house searches were even undertaken to root out Christian literature. Additionally, upper-class Christians were to lose their social status. Imperial freed men were to return to servitude, and slaves were prevented from being freed. Irrespective of social standing, all Christians were banned from pleading in court. In short, Diocletian attempted to systematically eradicate Christians from every fibre of the imperium. 2 further orders were then issued, one for the arrest and imprisonment of church leaders throughout the empire, the other for the release of those prepared to sacrifice. In 304, a 4th edict was issued, echoing those of Decius and Valerian before it. All inhabitants of the empire were required to offer an oblation to the gods. It seems, however, that neither Maximian nor Constantius Chlorus were as enthusiastic in enforcing the above edicts in their territories. Diocletian and Maximian formally abdicated in 305, and as a result, persecution lapsed considerably in the west. Indeed, Constantius did not seem to implement Diocletian's edicts in his own sphere, save the destruction of a few churches. In the east, however, Galerius, now Augustus, continued in his persecution of Christians with zeal. Expulsions, torture, and slaughter abounded. Constantine, who had been kept as a political hostage at Galerius's court, fled to join his father in Gaul, then in York, where Constantius died. Constantine was proclaimed as Augustus by his legions, but Galerius only acknowledged him as Caesar, promoting Severus, a senior military officer, to Augustus instead. Severus committed suicide in 307, which prompted Maxentius, the son of Maximian, to claim the title of Augustus for himself. This overview of the political landscape, though brief, establishes the matrix within which Constantine, the focus of our next objective, rose to power. Constantine and the beginnings of an imperial church. In tracing Constantine's rise to supremacy, I will highlight key details that illustrate his influence on the church, as well as those which indicate the impact of Christianity on him and the empire at large. The first Constantinian episode I wish to examine occurs immediately prior to his becoming the sole emperor of the West. As the tetrarchic mechanism continued to grind on, tensions between Constantine and Maxentius escalated, culminating in open conflict in the summer of 312. Marching from Gaul, Constantine and his army stormed into northern Italy, eventually arriving near Rome. The opposing armies first clashed a few miles north of the city at a site known as Red Rocks. Maxentius's troops were promptly driven back to the banks of the Tiber, near the Milvian Bridge. In anticipation of retreating to Rome to withstand a siege, they had already destroyed the permanent crossings over the river and constructed a makeshift one by aligning a series of boats. Maxentius and his troops were quickly overwhelmed by Constantine's forces and attempted to retreat across the improvised bridge. However, under the weight of the fleeing soldiers, the structure collapsed and many drowned, including Maxentius. His armor-clad body was later recovered, decapitated, and his head paraded as proof of Constantine's decisive victory. Relaying the above events, Eusebius records that while Constantine was still in northern Italy, he underwent a transformative vision. The church historian writes that about midday, when the sun was beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens, above the sun, bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this." After this spectacle, Eusebius asserts that the emperor received a dream in which he was instructed to fashion a standard made in the likeness of the sign that had been revealed to him, as a safeguard in all engagements with his enemies. As dawn arose, a standard, or labarum, in the shape of a cross was formed, bearing the Chi Rho monogram, a combination of the first 2 letters of Christos, or Christ. Another version of this incident is provided by Lactantius, a Christian teacher who served as a professor of rhetoric in Nicaea at the beginning of the 4th century, before the Diocletian persecution began. Lactantius's earlier retelling is similar, though it omits Constantine's cruciform vision, places him near the gates of Rome at the time of his dream, and depicts the emperor instructing his soldiers to mark their shields with a Chi Rho. Eusebius, who spent much time in Constantine's company over the course of his reign, recounts that the emperor would frequently speak of this vision. He even credits Constantine as his primary source of information. Additionally, it is worth noting that in the autumn of 312, following his victory over Maxentius, the emperor ordered the completion of a grand basilica in the center of Rome, a building used for legal and administrative affairs. Once completed, it became one of the largest structures in the heart of the capital. In its western apse, Constantine placed an enormous statue of himself, the remains of which one can still see today. According to Eusebius, one of the stone hands held a labarum in the form of a cross, marked with the Chi Rho. Underneath, an inscription proclaimed that Constantine's victory was achieved by virtue of this salutary sign, an obvious indicator of the emperor's indebtedness. Coins and medallions were likewise struck, depicting Constantine with a Christogram on his helmet. Much academic ink has been spilt on the nature of Constantine's experience, often dubbed as his conversion. However, for our present purposes, it is sufficient to acknowledge that for Constantine, as evidenced by Eusebius and Lactantius' accounts, and his own actions, this event was clearly foundational, one that would shape his subsequent attitude towards Christianity and ultimately the religious trajectory of the empire. Inspired by his divine encounter, Eusebius reports that Constantine immediately summoned Christian clergy to his entourage in an effort to elucidate his vision. Among them, it appears, was Osius, the bishop of Cordoba. This demonstrates that Constantine was deliberately putting himself under the sway of Christian advisors. Indeed, throughout Constantine's reign, Osius would not only prove himself to be an erudite and respected clergyman, but the emperor's foremost ecclesiastical companion for over a decade. At the same time as constructing the aforementioned basilica in Rome, Constantine also became acquainted with the churchmen of the city and even gifted the Lateran palace from the imperial estates to Bishop Miltiades, a gesture which reflects the emperor's developing respect for the episcopate and its emerging institutional significance. Constantine's growing respect towards Christianity also appears to correlate with his increasing disregard for paganism. According to Eusebius, after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine and his army marched in triumph through Rome. A triumph was a particular kind of elaborate celebration in Rome, one with a long and prestigious pedigree. Victorious generals or emperors would parade through the streets of Rome, accompanied by their army and the spoils of war, before ascending the Capitoline Hill to offer a sacrifice at the Temple of Jupiter. In keeping with this tradition, on the 29th of October, 312, Constantine entered the city with his troops in tow and Maxentius' head mounted firmly on a spike. Yet commemorating this event the following year in Trier, a pagan panegyrist curiously omits any mention of sacrifice and remarks that some had even complained that Constantine approached the palace too abruptly. Likewise, Eusebius makes no reference to a pagan sacrifice. Instead, he depicts Constantine as one who possessed inward piety towards God, and immediately rendered a thanksgiving to him as the author of his victory. If Eusebius' account is reliable, then Constantine's triumphal entry marks a pivotal shift in the religious orientation of the empire. His public conduct displayed that he did not owe his victory to the pagan gods, as his predecessors had done, but rather to the God he had recently encountered. Timothy Barnes has argued that Constantine's victory did not meet the formal conditions for an official triumph, which, he contends, accounts for the absence of a sacrifice. According to Barnes, Roman emperors did not celebrate triumphs over foes in a civil war. However, as Lang has emphasized, 2 earlier triumphal arches in Rome were built to commemorate the victors of extended civil wars, Titus and Septimius Severus. Additionally, after examining how various Romans characterized their own conflicts, he concludes that it was permissible to conduct a triumph after a civil war if the opponent could be construed as a hostile or a tyrant. Many of the contemporary sources surrounding the Battle of the Milvian Bridge portray Maxentius as a tyrannus, and upon the completion of Constantine's triumphal arch in 315, the Senate's inscription explicitly credits the emperor with the destruction of a tyrant. Given this, it does indeed seem that Constantine's failure to sacrifice was deliberate. Jupiter's central role in the empire had been consciously displaced. The god who had previously been associated with the emperor had now been sidelined, and in so doing, Constantine had instigated the beginning of a new religious era, one in which Christianity would ultimately predominate. Another significant event in the establishment of this era occurred in 313. By this time, Galerius had been dead for 2 years. Prior to his death, he had elevated Licinius to the rank of Augustus in the east. Additionally, since his capture of Rome, Constantine had been proclaimed Augustus Maximus by the Senate. Before departing the imperial capital, Constantine wrote to Licinius, inviting him to meet in February in Milan. The outcome of their meeting was the issuance of the so-called Edict of Milan, a title first attached to this document in the 16th century. As it stands, the decree, often described as granting universal religious toleration, only survives in the contents of 2 epistles, one recorded by Eusebius and the other Lactantius. This has led some scholars to question whether an official edict ever actually existed. Regardless, the conclusion reached by Constantine and Licinius remains foundational for the gradual altering of the empire's religious landscape. It is worth noting that Christian persecution had already been called off by Galerius, one of its most enthusiastic enforcers, through an edict of toleration issued in 311. In this decree, Galerius asserts that, in light of his most gentle clemency and his perpetual habit of showing indulgent pardon to all men, he had resolved to extend his speediest indulgence to Christians, who, he adds, may now rebuild their churches. The central philosophical tenet undergirding this edict is the principle of indulgentia, unmerited forbearance granted by an emperor to a religion that remained for him fundamentally repugnant. This is corroborated later in the edict, where Galerius laments that for some reason such great willfulness had infected the Christians, and such a great stupidity had besieged them. They had refused to conform to the imperial orders against their religion, and instead acted in accord with their own willfulness and however they wished. Here, freedom is framed in wholly negative terms. It is a quality which amounts to disobedience and ultimately incongruity with the empire. In stark contrast with Galerius's edict, the Edict of Milan rests on the positive notion of religious liberty. It expresses Constantine and Licinius's joint desire to give the Christians and everyone else freedom to follow the religion each may want. Christians are not merely tolerated, they are empowered to practice their faith and affirmed for doing so. Indeed, the language of freedom permeates both extant versions of the edict. The word liber and its cognates pervade the Latin Lactantian text, and the Greek words with the root elefthero appear throughout Eusebius's account. As Lenski observes, the concept of religious freedom behind the Edict of Milan finds its most obvious correspondence in the works of Lactantius. By examining the emperor's writings, scholars have increasingly acknowledged the rhetorician's influence on the formation of Constantine's Christian conscience. According to Jerome, Lactantius also served as tutor to Constantine's son, Crispus, demonstrating his proximity to the imperial family. This raises an important question. Was Lactantius already in contact with Constantine at the time of the Edict of Milan? We cannot be certain, but according to Barnes, who offers a cursory outline of the rhetorician's career, it was in 311 and 312 that Lactantius was teaching Crispus, and doubtless conversing with his pupil's father. Crucially, at this point, Lactantius had nearly completed the last of his 7-tome defense of Christian faith and ethics, the Divine Institutes. Significant for our purposes is Book 5, in which he argues at length that religious adherence cannot be coerced. For example, Lactantius writes, "There is no need for force or injustice, for religion cannot be compelled. The matter is to be dealt with through words, not whips, in order to accommodate the needs of the will." Notably, emphasis on volition features heavily throughout his argument. Elsewhere, he comments that nothing is so much a matter of the will as religion, that unless a sacrifice happens willingly and intentionally, it is a sacrilege, and that Christians do not seek to make anyone who is unwilling worship our God, who is the God of all, whether they like it or not. This work clearly reflects the sentiment of religious freedom as an act of will, articulated in the edict. Likewise, it echoes the edict's repeated efforts to ground religious liberty in the giving of due reverence and respect to the divinity, for it is only through the worship of free minds that the divinity will provide us with its usual care and benevolence. Constantine certainly became intimately familiar with the ideas expounded in the divine institutes over the years, as evidenced by many of the themes he engaged with in his own writings, such as the Oration to the Assembly of the Saints. And after completing the final book, circa 313, Lactantius even dedicated his series to the emperor himself. Admittedly, Constantine's encounter with the text before his meeting with Licinius in Milan cannot be confirmed. Still, it remains possible, and if true, would demonstrate the extent to which Christianity had profoundly influenced not only his judgment at this early stage, but the religious composition of the empire, laying the groundwork for the eventual establishment of an imperial church. In addition to granting religious freedom to all inhabitants of the empire, the Edict of Milan was also significant in addressing the issue of confiscated property. All who had purchased places of Christian worship were instructed to return them immediately, without money and without any demand for payment. This command was supplemented by a provision which allowed the current owners to appear before the local magistrate in order to be reimbursed by the royal treasury. Beyond mere toleration, then, the edict stands as one of the earliest instances of imperial initiative in actively supporting and regulating Christian affairs. Yet, even in the winter of 312 to 313, Constantine had already sent out letters ordering the restitution of property to Christians within his own territories, as well as granting Christian clergy monetary subsidies and legal exemptions. Significantly, these subsidies were only to be distributed to clergy recognized by Osius of Cordoba, thereby constricting the scope of Constantine's benevolence to those deemed orthodox by Osius himself. Thus, when speaking of imperial patronage towards the church, it must be understood that such patronage was selective and that some Christian groups were excluded. Indeed, a later law passed by Constantine specifies that exemptions from compulsory public services were only to be granted to clergy of the Catholic Church and not heretics or schismatics. Evidently, Constantine had institutionally incentivized adherence to Orthodox Christianity, a move in which one can already detect the formation of an imperial church proper. Over the course of his reign, Constantine would issue further laws that contributed to steering the empire in an increasingly Christian direction, whilst also elevating the status of the church. Time only permits us to examine a few of these briefly. The first I want to draw attention to recognizes the synodal decisions of bishops as legally binding, which, as Eusebius reports, governors of provinces were not allowed to rescind, on the basis that the priests of God were more trustworthy than any magistrate. In another law, bishops were given the privilege of being tried by their peers, irrespective of their accused crimes, and in a law issued in 318, Christians gained the right to take their cases before an ecclesiastical court rather than any state court. The rulings of those bishops are afforded the same authority as those of a state court. Given Constantine's immersion in Christian thought by this point, it is possible that this law was motivated by 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 to 7, which discourages Christians from laying lawsuits before those who have no standing in the church. In any case, when these laws are considered together, it is obvious that Christian bishops were being integrated into the administrative fabric of the empire. Christians more broadly were also installed into official government positions. Even on a personal level, Constantine had committed himself and his household to the company and care of Christians. Thus, whilst it is true to assert that Constantine had influenced the status and capabilities of the church within the empire, it is equally true to affirm the impact of Christianity on him and his legislation. This reciprocal relationship is illustrated by a law issued in 321, which permitted the manumission of slaves by bishops in a church. Here, the church is clearly conferred with a new kind of legal authority, yet the law's dedication to Osius suggests his influence on this particular instance of jurisprudence. These laws helped to establish Christianity as a dominant force within the empire's political sphere. In parallel, Constantine's actions also facilitated its ascendancy in the religious sphere. In 315, to celebrate his 10th year in the purple, Constantine returned to Rome for the first time since his victory against Maxentius. The Senate had organized a series of extravagant festivities in honor of the emperor, set to unfold over the course of a month. Despite being a common feature of previous Decennalia, Constantine did not offer a sacrifice to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Yet unlike the earlier ambiguity surrounding his triumphal entry, Eusebius records that the emperor specifically instructed Christian clergy to offer the Eucharist to God as pure sacrifices free from flame or smoke. The focal point of the empire's religiosity was now blatantly aimed towards Christianity. It is also possible that Constantine eventually prohibited pagan sacrifices throughout the Imperium, though this is highly contested. What is certain is that Constantine undertook the project of constructing monumental churches across the empire, an endeavor in which he was accompanied by his mother, Helen. The grandeur of these buildings easily eclipsed the splendor of most, if not all, previous churches. In addition to the Lateran Basilica in Rome, Constantine and his family oversaw the construction of seven further basilicas in and around the city. Churches were also erected in Antioch and in Jerusalem and in its vicinity, where Helen patronized the construction of several sites, including the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives. And over the site of Christ's tomb, Constantine commissioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was completed 2 years before his death in 335. Clearly, under Constantine, the cityscapes of the empire were increasingly adorned with lavish Christian architecture, visible evidence of the church's imperial patronage. Yet nowhere was this patronage more tangibly expressed than in the foundation of Constantinople, much of which was financed by the confiscation of pagan property. After defeating Licinius in 324 and becoming the sole emperor, Constantine decided to build a new city at Byzantium, which would become the empire's capital in 330. However, rather than simply developing the pre-existing city, he razed it to the ground, destroying its temples, shrines, and public buildings. Once completed, Constantinople had no non-Christian temples, no other non-Christian buildings or monuments, and no pre-Christian history. The crux of the empire had been dedicated to Christ. In addition to providing financial aid and enacting favorable legislation, Constantine also personally intervened in the church's internal affairs. In 311, in the wake of persecution, schism arose within the North African churches following the death of Mensurius, the bishop of Carthage, and the installation of Caecilian as his successor. His legitimacy was challenged by a group of Numidian bishops on the grounds that he had been ordained by a traditor bishop, someone who had surrendered the scriptures during the Diocletian persecution. In response, they rejected his authority and appointed a rival bishop, Majorinus, in his place. Constantine probably became aware of the dispute through Ossius, his ecclesiastical advisor. Around the time he sent a letter to Caecilian in 313, in which he displays his knowledge of the so-called Donatist schism, he also wrote to Annalinus, the proconsul of Africa. In that letter, Constantine remarked that great dangers come to the state when we neglect the religion in which the highest reverence of the most holy celestial power is safeguarded. Importantly, it is within this context that he instructed the state benefits to be given to Caecilian. In his own words, since they offer the highest adoration to the divinity, it seems to me that they ought to receive the highest reward the state can offer. This reveals that Constantine perceived a reciprocal relationship between the harmony and prosperity of the church and that of the empire, a view he would reiterate following the verdict of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Annalinus promptly responded, enclosing in his reply an unsealed petition from the Donatist bishops, which read, "We appeal to you, Constantine, best of emperors since you come from a just family, and a disagreement has arisen between us and other African bishops, and we pray that your piety will guide you to give us judges from Gaul." Constantine heeded their appeal and ordered a synod to be convened in Rome, led by Bishop Miltiades, to settle the dispute. In October 313, a council ruled in favour of Caecilian, though the Donatist schism was far from resolved. From this point forward, Constantine would continue to involve himself in ecclesiastical disputes, organising clergy to hold councils, some of which he attended, and even hearing appeals himself. After him, most emperors followed suit. The Donatist controversy thus became an early proving ground for a new dynamic between emperor and church, with imperial authority actively shaping ecclesiastical conduct and episcopal decisions increasingly endorsed by the state. Throughout his Donatist correspondence, Constantine repeatedly affirms that God has committed the management of all earthly affairs to him, while consistently recognizing the interdependence between the church's well-being and the stability of the state. The Donatist schism, it seems, also prompted him to reflect more seriously on the precise nature of episcopal authority. Strikingly, in a letter addressed to the bishops who had attended the Council of Arles in 314, Constantine asserts, "As far as truth is concerned, a judgment delivered by priests ought to be considered as valid as though Christ himself were present and delivering judgment." Taken together, Constantine's writings portray a ruler who felt divinely entrusted to secure unity in the church, not only for the sake of honouring God, but for the preservation of imperial cohesion, and who came to view bishops as essential instruments in maintaining that harmony. Perhaps this helps to explain why he later financed the gathering of bishops from across the empire and beyond at Nicaea to resolve the Arian dispute. In short, tracing Constantine's rise reveals that his relationship with Christianity was not one-directional. Rather, it was a mutual exchange, in which he shaped the church's institutional role while simultaneously allowing Christian thought and structures to fashion imperial governance. Two brief reflections on the transition from persecuted church to an emerging imperial church. Having briefly considered the imperial patronage afforded to the church by Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and his involvement in ecclesiastical affairs more generally, I now turn to my final objective. This involves exploring two questions. First, was the favourable orientation of the empire towards Christianity, brought about by Constantine, and the very notion of a Christian emperor something inconceivable to, unwelcome by, or even incompatible with the thinking and expectations of those Christians who lived during the era of the persecuted church? And second, does Christian history offer any precedent that might justify Constantine's involvement in the life of the church? To begin addressing the first question, I turn to the writings of Paul the Apostle. A key passage that directly bears on our question is Romans 13, 1-7, which reads, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honour to whom honour is owed." Dissecting this pericope, one can discern that, for Paul, the authority of emperors proceeds directly from the authority of God. Allegiance to Augustus is thus subordinate to fealty to God, yet this does not undermine the emperor's rule. On the contrary, it is what endows that rule with legitimacy. As such, Paul envisages the emperor, and by extension the state, as an arbiter of God's justice on earth. In recognition of this, and out of respect of his divinely appointed role, Christians should fully embrace their responsibilities as residents under Roman rule, such as paying their taxes. Similar affirmations of civic responsibility can be seen in 1 Peter 2, 10-17, and in the 6th chapter of the Wisdom of Solomon. These texts demonstrate that Christians since the 1st century, and even certain Jewish groups, had acknowledged, though perhaps reluctantly, the idea of a divinely sanctioned emperor. Consequently, Christians before the so-called Constantinian shift positioned themselves as loyal subjects who could coexist peacefully with Roman governance, and even integrate into the empire's social and political fabric. They did not perceive a dissonance between their religious convictions and civic responsibilities, a mindset that would later underpin the cooperation of Christian bishops with imperial authority under Constantine. Sacrificing to the gods, of course, remained a clear exception to this posture. As Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, clarifies, who was martyred around 155, "We have been taught to pay all proper respect to powers and authorities of God's appointment, so long as it does not compromise us." Beyond recognizing the legitimacy of imperial authority, Paul's letters also consider the spiritual dimension of the Christian response to rulers. In 1 Timothy 2, 1-4, for example, he instructs that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings, and all who are in high positions. "This is good," he writes, "and pleasing in the sight of God our Saviour, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." Two significant inferences can be drawn from this passage. First, the liturgical life of Christians is to encompass intercession on behalf of all, including those in positions of political power. Second, implicit in Paul's exhortation is the belief that such intercessory prayer might contribute to the conversion of rulers, bringing them into the fold of those who have come to the knowledge of the truth. Given this theological backdrop, Constantine's emergence as a Christian emperor need not have seemed entirely foreign to the early Christian imagination. Paul's vision greatly impacted the theological content of Clement of Rome's first letter to the Corinthians, written around the year 96. The influence of Romans in 1 Timothy is most evident at the close of the letter, where Clement appends a liturgical intercession that begins by asking God to direct the faithful so that their works are good and pleasing in thy sight and the sight of our rulers. It continues, "For it is thou, O Master, who in thy supreme and ineffable might hast given to them their sovereign authority, to the intent that we, acknowledging the glory and honour thou hast bestowed upon them, should show all submission. Grant unto them then, O Lord, health and peace, harmony and security, that they may exercise without offence the dominion which thou hast accorded them. Vouchsafe so to direct their counsels as may be good and pleasing in thy sight, that in peace and mildness they may put to godly use the authority thou hast given them, and so find mercy with thee." Echoes of Pauline themes are plentiful. Importantly, however, Clement reaffirms them even while addressing a community that still bore the haunting memory of persecution under Nero. Notably, the practice of praying for the emperor, his rule, and the welfare of the state is mentioned throughout the writings of early Christian authors, many of whom had either experienced persecution or were acutely aware of its consequences. This suggests that, despite adversity, early Christians consciously cultivated a positive disposition towards the empire. Such a stance sharply contrasts with Roman perspectives from Tacitus onwards, which consistently portrayed Christians as threats to the stability and order of the empire. Several Christians even wrote directly to emperors, appealing for a halt to persecution, grounded in their conviction that they had been appointed by God to act justly. One such figure is Justin Martyr, who addressed his first apology to the Emperor Antonius Pius and his sons. Boldly, he remarks that they are often called pious men and philosophers, guardians of justice and lovers of learning, yet questions whether this is true. For Justin, pious men and philosophers should honour and cherish only what is true. It is by sound reason, logismos, he continues, that the emperors prove themselves to be good judges before God. And as part of their prayers, Christians supplicate God to grant them prudence and discernment, sophron logismos. Justin's frequent references to reason in these early passages are crucial to the development of his argument. Later, for instance, he writes that Christ is the Word, Logos, of whom all mankind partakes. Those who have lived reasonably, and still do, he asserts, are Christians. The same idea is articulated in his second apology, addressed to Marcus Aurelius, where, for example, he states, "Everything that the philosophers and legislators discovered and expressed well, they accomplished through their discovery and contemplation of some part of the Logos. But, since they did not have a full knowledge of the Logos, which is Christ, they often contradicted themselves." Evidently, the implication of both apologies is the claim that to embrace reason is tantamount to embracing Christ. For Justin, then, if sound reason is the criterion by which the goodness of a ruler is determined, it seems that a truly rational ruler who governs without contradiction would be a Christian. And given that he admitted Christians pray for God to guide the emperors in their attainment of reason, it seems that, to some extent, they were actively engaged in praying for their conversion. For certain Christians belonging to the persecuted church, then, the notion of a Christian emperor, and by extension imperial favour, was not something unexpected or inconceivable, nor was it incompatible with their worldview. Rather, it appears to be the realization of a hope they shared. This much is articulated, at least, by Lactantius, who, commenting on the ascension of Constantine to the throne, writes, "The Lord has heard those supplications which you, my best beloved Donatus, pour forth in his presence all day long, and the supplications of the rest of our brethren, who by glorious confession have obtained an everlasting crown, the reward of their faith. Behold, all adversaries are destroyed, and tranquility having been re-established throughout the Roman Empire, the late oppressed church rises again, and the temple of God, overthrown by the hands of the wicked, is built with more glory than before. For God has raised up princes to rescind the impious and sanguinary edicts of the tyrants and provide for the welfare of mankind, so that now the cloud of past times is dispelled, and peace and serenity gladden all hearts." The second question I wish to address is whether Constantine's involvement in ecclesiastical affairs had a historical precedent, or whether it was an entirely novel development. As evidenced by figures such as Justin Martyr, Athenagoras of Athens, Melito of Sardis, and Tertullian, appeals to the emperor and civil authorities were a frequent feature of early Christian literature. These appeals, however, were predominantly concerned with the treatment and status of Christians in the political sphere. The case of Paul of Samosata, by contrast, presents a striking exception, a rare instance in which bishops themselves actively sought imperial intervention in order to resolve an internal conflict within the church. In later theological discourse, Paul's name became a rhetorical device, invoked by theologians to discredit their opponents by associating them with his views. Yet the precise reasons for his eventual condemnation remain unclear. A detailed analysis of his theology lies beyond the scope of this presentation, particularly given that the available evidence is both sparse and at times contradictory. Regardless of his doctrinal positions, however, Paul was widely criticized for his conduct and demeanor. Soon after his appointment to the See of Antioch around 260, his alleged behavior began to raise alarm among his fellow bishops. A synod convened in 264 to reprimand him, and in response, Paul assured them of his intention to improve. Apparently, no such improvement occurred, prompting the bishops to hold a second council in the winter of 268 to 269. Part of the synod's encyclical, which outlines the accusations against Paul, is preserved by Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. The document paints the bishop as someone who is arrogant and deceitful, guilty of extortion, and prone to self-aggrandizement, encouraging his congregation to clap, jump, and sing psalms in his honor. Finding Paul unrepentant in attitude and heretical in belief, the synod moved to depose him. Paul, however, refused to relinquish his post and, supported by some in Antioch, remained in possession of his office and its accompanying church building. Immediately after relating this, Eusebius reports, "The Emperor Aurelian, on being petitioned, gave an extremely just decision regarding the matter, ordering the assignment of the building to those with whom the bishops of the doctrine in Italy and Rome should communicate in writing. Thus, then, was the aforesaid man driven with the utmost indignity from the church by the ruler of this world. Such indeed was the disposition of Aurelian towards us at the time. Here, Eusebius describes a clear instance of an emperor being appealed to by Christian bishops in an effort to establish justice, echoing the position of the earlier apologists. By the time of Aurelian's ascension to the throne in 270, Gallienus's Edict of Toleration had been in effect for nearly a decade. During this period, multiple letters from Christian bishops were addressed to the emperor, requesting the restoration of their confiscated property. When considered alongside the works of the apologists, these appeals suggest that for Christians, writing in both times of persecution and of relative peace, seeking intervention was not only permissible, but often strategically employed. In the case of Paul of Samosata, is especially significant, as it marks the first known instance of an emperor actively enforcing the decision of Christian bishops. Whilst it is true that Constantine would become far more involved in ecclesiastical affairs than any of his predecessors, even to the extent of contributing to the theological discussions at Nicaea, a council over which he personally presided, the case of Paul, the letters to Gallienus, and the early Christian apologies nonetheless provide an important precedent. They show that both the act of requesting imperial intervention and the possibility of imperial compliance had already taken root within the Christian imagination. In this light, Constantine's involvement in ecclesiastical affairs does not appear to radically depart from the expectations of earlier Christians, but rather continues and develops an existing trajectory. With all this in mind, perhaps the transition from persecuted church to the emergence of an imperial church was much less abrupt for Christians than one might first assume. After Constantine, the questions facing the church in the 4th century were no longer about whether the emperor would support Christianity, but rather, to what extent should he be involved? How much authority does he possess in ecclesiastical disputes? Can he rightly shape the structure and beliefs of the church? And what are the consequences if he harbours sympathy for condemned heretics? Depending on the emperor, Christians either endorsed their intimate involvement or sought to restrict the scope of their authority. These became the pressing concerns of a church no longer persecuted by pagan rulers, but now entangled with imperial power, a church which, throughout the history of Byzantium and thereafter, would continually seek to negotiate and define its boundaries with the state. Thank you.